היי everyone, שלום לכולם. ברוכים הבאים לעוד אירוע עם אורחת הכבוד, נוביק, והסופרת המדהימה רותם ברוכין. זה הדבר האחרון שאני אגיד בעברית, ועכשיו אנחנו כולנו עוברים לאנגלית למשך האירוע. Hi everyone. So I'm Marina Berlin. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an author and media critic, and with me here today are our amazing guest of honor, author Nowik, and our amazing local author, Rotem Barukhin, winner of several Geffen Awards for her short stories. So I'm gonna ask you guys questions, and you will answer them, and that's the format of the event, just so that everyone at home knows what's going on. So my first question for both of you is, how did you first start writing fiction? And Naomi, would you like to start?
Sure. I started writing fanfic. I would say I wrote some fanfic even in high school, but I wasn't connected to a community. So, I actually feel fairly strongly that fan fiction specifically is very much about community. I mean, I had a community of I had one friend, but I wasn't brave enough to kind of show her my fanfic at the time. It was a little still too personal, and I didn't quite grasp it. And then I was in college, my sophomore year. I lived in a dorm with a bunch of women who were all in the sciences, and it was all single rooms except for one big double room. And once a week, we would all pile into that big double room together and watch Star Trek: The Next Generation. And I had never watched TNG before. And the first episode, I'm pretty sure that it was literally the first episode I saw was The Inner Light, which for those of you who were not fans of Next Generation, you should be. But it was basically, it's one of the best episodes of the series. And it just blew me away. And I immediately and one of my friends showed me how to log on to, I was at Brown at the time, there was this was before the web. There was literally not web browsing. You couldn't, there was no web browsing. The internet was entirely text-based. And, but she showed me how to get onto Brown's student Vax VMS server. And what there were mailing lists. And I joined the Strek L mailing list where people were talking about the episode. And one of the things that was happening on there was that there were people posting fan fiction stories. And I read them and I was, this is great. Wait, this is, yes. And I started writing. And I basically, that became my hobby. That became my hobby for about 10 years. At the time, I also simultaneously was getting very interested in programming, in computer games, and I ended up basically doing fan fiction writing as a hobby while I worked on a computer science degree. And then I had a chance to work on a computer game that was basically it was the sequel to Neverwinter Nights, if anyone remembers that game. And a very small independent team got hired to build the expansion pack. And this team basically was, one of my friends was the lead designer. And he said, we kind of could use a coder. We don't have the budget for a coder, but we've got this role for a junior designer. And I'd finished my master's degree at that point. I was doing research, but I was not incredibly excited by my research. I wanted to build computer games. And so I got in, I said, yes, I will do this. And I loved it. It was a wonderful project, but the joy for me, the pleasure was doing the storytelling through code as opposed to just the pure code. And then at the end of it, And what I didn't love was, the hours were, the computer game industry is still fairly bad, but at the time it was even less mature, and essentially, and mature in the sense of a mature industry that has reasonable practices. There were people literally working, 80 to 100-hour weeks on a routine basis. Like crunch mode was just a thing that people did not reasonably deliver games on time. They didn't know how. Lots of companies still don't know how. And it was just not a human sort of process. There wasn't really a game company in Manhattan that I knew that I could go to, and my life was in Manhattan. And so for all these reasons, I kind of came out of it feeling like, well, I love this experience, but I don't love this industry. I'm not fresh out of college. I'm not, a 22-year-old who wants to spend literally all their time in the office. And my friend said, you should try writing a novel. And I said, all right. And I tried writing a novel, and it's, that scene in Monty Python where it's like, I built a castle in the swamp and it fell down. So I built another castle and it sank into the swamp. And then I built a third castle and the third castle stayed up. It was almost like that. I sat down and I tried to write a novel. And it was just like, bleh. It had no life. It had no, I think to some extent I was trying too hard. I was trying to make something that I thought of as a novel, as opposed to really writing because I had a story that I really wanted to tell. And so I stopped it and gave up on it. And then shortly afterwards, I got into Master and Commander fandom, and I wrote some Master and Commander fanfic. But what was interesting was that I discovered before I had worked on the computer game, all my fanfic was short. 5,000 words was a long story for me. I wrote little vignettes. There was no structure. There was no plot. And all of a sudden, and I think this is largely because I came out of the computer game experience where we had to structure the story, the narrative arc out fairly clearly. You had to sort of think about the beats in a very kind of engineering kind of way, because you had to tell the artists what the cinematics were going to be. We had to decide on this quite early on. And so all of a sudden, my stories in that fandom, like the first one was like 6,000 words, then 11,000 words, then 17,000 words, then like 25,000 words. And it was no longer hard for me. In fact, it was more like I suddenly felt, it was more like, ignition happening. And then I started writing a story where I turned one of them into a dragon, because that's the kind of thing that I do. And I remember very clearly, and in fact, this is still kind of my own internal benchmark for when am I writing fanfic and when is this story original fiction? And it was like, it was this sensation of like, I don't want these characters. I don't want these characters. I have this idea and you're not quite right. You're not fitting into these spots, because for me, fan fiction is always about the characters. And if it's not those characters, then it's not fan fiction. And if it's not connected to the original source, if it's not sort of really intimately tied. But so anyway, so the point is that I kind of was like, I want these to be different characters, because that would be the more of the story that I'm trying to tell. And so I stopped and I basically started writing Lawrence and Temeraire's first meeting. And it was, obviously, and you can see, right? You can see Master and Commander, you can see, and you can see Pern, you can see, right? You can see those things in Temeraire. But it's still mine, right? And that's that's the feeling. And I do feel like it does stand alone. It's more, and in fact, I do think that a lot of writers are super anxious about claiming originality and claiming that, right, you know, that sense. And I've never felt that way. I felt like I want you to see my family, the family tree of my stories. But anyway, so that is actually how I started writing my very first actual novel. But of course, I've been writing for 10 years before then. So that is my long story. And now I want to hear your story, Wrotem.
Wrotem?
That's too bad, because I just really enjoyed hearing your story and I wanted you to continue. I want to steal the stage for a second to say how much I'm excited and honored to be here. And I'm such a huge fan. And thank you, Marina, for bringing Nami here. So now after I stole the stage, the question was how I started in writing, right?
How did you start writing fiction?
Yeah. Okay. So I started like dabbling in creative writing in somewhere around middle school, but my first actual fiction writing was fan fiction too, just like Naomi. And I was 11 or 12, something along the line of this. And I made my first steps not as a writer, but as a reader in fantasy literature. So fantasy literature was like one shelf in the library, and wherever was there, I read. And I first found a book which I just did not like the ending. There was a character, it died. I was super sad, and I sort of wrote a fix-it fanfic. So I did not have the word to call it a fix-it fanfic at the time, but I took the page, I marked a great X on it, and I started writing in the margin of the page how the story would be different if this character did not die. So the problem was, after rewriting this whole book, there was next book in the series, which was basically, most of its base was leaning upon the fact that this character died. So I had to rewrite that too. I mean, I had no choice, right? I mean, it was a must.
Right.
Well, luckily, I guess I realized it was kind of silly to write in the margins, so I didn't destroy another book. I mean, this was not a library book by this time. It was my book. And I still have...
No judgment, no judgment.
And yes, so I took a new notebook and I started writing, and I wrote the whole book, and I wrote this fix-it. And I think I copied a few paragraphs from the original book, and I just had this notebook, which was like 1 million words long. And I think this was the beginning. By the way, the book was The Obsidian Oracle by Troy Denning. So Mr. Denning, thank you for starting off my writing career, and also you're a terrible person for killing the character off. But when the internet got into my life, I also have this stage of internet coming into my life. Suddenly there were like forums, there were like mailing lists, there were places where I could talk with people who were other fangirls and fanboys. And there were like fanfic groups in Hebrew. And I think the first time I started like writing was like role-playing Buffy characters with some people on some Buffy forum. This was so much fun, and I actually started writing original fiction thanks to the Society of Science Fiction and Fantasy, if that's the correct name in English. And there were like these forums that were for young writers. I just started writing my stories there. I got a lot of critique, but I got very good beta ratings, and that's how I started publishing stories.
Amazing. Okay, so my next question to you both is about a topic that I know is close to both of your hearts, which is dragons. So obviously, Naomi, you wrote an entire series that included dragons, Temeraire, and obviously you weaved them into the Napoleonic Wars. Wrotem, you wrote about dragons in your story, My Last Dragon, which won the Geffen Award, where dragons are part of a stem cell treatment for certain illnesses. So I was just wondering what drew you both to kind of reinventing the dragon trope or playing around with it. Let's start with Naomi.
I don't know if you feel the same way, Wrotem, but I feel like dragons in a lot of ways are this, I mean, they facilitate a kind of power fantasy, right? And that's a way that they're used in a lot of traditional media. And they're used either to represent natural forces a lot of times, things that are too large in a way to sort of larger than human forces. That's often why they're useful for like a hero to overcome a dragon. And then obviously, and I'm pretty sure that Pern was the start of this idea of, you know, dragons that you would actually ride, that you would tame, that you would, and that you could then harness that power for yourself and share in that power. And I think it's kind of interesting that dragons make that kind of move around the time of, you know, sort of things like space flight and the nuclear bomb, right? That's largely this context. And I also think it's interesting that it was a woman writer, that it was Anne McCaffrey who kind of sort of said, well, why do you have to fight the dragon? How about you just, you know, ride the dragon? How about you meld with the dragon in this deeply intimate way? And I feel like all of those things are really interesting. You know, that sense of all the ways in which dragons, the word dragon, the concept of dragon kind of carries all of these connotations, all of this weight along with it, makes them super interesting to play with. And, you know, in fact, I've sort of made a habit of trying to work a dragon in to almost all my work since, that you can find like sometimes small dragons, sometimes, you know, metaphorical dragons into a lot of my work. And that's a sort of, you know, I feel like they're just really satisfying to play with. So Rotem, you let's go back and forth a little bit. I want to, you know, it's
exactly what you said. They're fascinating creatures to play with, but I want to say that you changed my view about dragons, because I always felt that there was like this mighty and mysterious beast, and the Anne McCaffrey, of course, like grew up on Anne McCaffrey. So there was like this Tolkienish fantasy, this epic fantasy, this wonderful creation that dragons are like epic fantasy. They have to be like hand in hand with mages and sorcerers and elves and everything like that. And I always plan to like write epic fantasy someday, but you can't like write, mostly in Hebrew, we write short stories and novellas because there's not like a lot of places the book is hard. The book market is harder. Thank you. Sorry, English, blah. So when I write short stories, it's harder to like, you know, get the grasp of this epic fantasy. But when I read Temeraire, this was like amazing. I was like, it's like you said yesterday, I think, in the Q&A, that Temeraire is not actually magic. It's Napoleonic Wars, but there's dragons. And I was like, that's true. Dragons could be like part of other reality. They just take the dragon, put it in another reality, and that's okay. And I think in my head, like the story I wrote, My Last Dragon, was sort of the future of Temeraire. It has nothing to do with the Temeraire series, but I thought, well, dragons in Temeraire are like, apart from being a part of war and helping in the war, they're like a logistic problem. They're hard. I mean, you need to take care of them. You need a ground crew, you need an air crew, you need to feed them a lot of food, and you need harness, and you need to wash them sometimes when Lawrence decides that washing dragons in a thing, and then everybody decides that the dragons decide that washing them is a thing. So I thought, okay, so in the Napoleonic War, it makes sense. But when it comes to our reality, like nowadays, and my story takes place nowadays, so what are we going to do with those dragons? We're not going to use them for war. We have much more efficient stuff for war, but we have like tanks and I mean, and so I kind of thought, well, dragons are going to be lonely. They're going to be apart from us all. They're going to be huge and they can like step on a person, and it's not fun for anyone to be like in the presence of dragon. And there comes the stem cell treatment, which was actually my partner's idea because she's a neuroscientist. And I just thought, okay, so I can like get the magic that is a dragon, this mysterious and beautiful and great creature, and put it in our reality. And they have to live a completely different reality where humans are like no longer need their help. They fear them. And the magic in itself, the dragon's magic itself is not enough to like be super, super exciting for humans.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think that that's one of the nice, right? That is one of the pleasures of dragons. That dragon is evocative. Like when you say, I'm writing a story about a dragon, it's immediately evocative. It communicates something to the reader, and yet it's malleable enough that you can do almost anything you want with it, right? That, and, I actually often talk about this in the sense of the pleasures of retellings. The pleasure is one of the pleasures of fan fiction, and one of the pleasures of retellings, of being openly in conversation with a story, is that it multiplies the kinds of pleasure that you can give to the reader. And what I mean by that is, so when you think about it, what are the kinds of pleasures that you can get from hearing a story? If I tell you, if you're told a story, like many people enjoy rereading a book, many people enjoy rewatching a favorite movie. You certainly, for instance, storytelling, right? When you sit down and listen to a storyteller, even at the dinner table, sometimes the same person will tell a story, their same interesting anecdote again. And sometimes some of the pleasure of that is in recognition, in saying, oh, I know this story. I know what's going to happen next, right? When you're doing a retelling, so, and then there's the pleasure of a brand new story being told to you out of nowhere, right? And it's like, what's going to happen next? You had the pleasure of suspense, the pleasure of discovery. With retellings, with fan fiction, you can have both the pleasure of the familiar and the pleasure of the new, plus a third pleasure, which is the pleasure of something familiar turned around, right? Where it's like, oh, you've taken this thing, you took my expectation. I had an expectation because I've heard this story before. I know this universe, and you've taken that expectation and you suddenly flipped it.
Exactly.
And all of a sudden, right? And so that's what working with something like dragons gives you, the same way that working with dragons, working with established fantastical tropes or stories gives you some of the tools that you have very naturally in the fanfic tool chest. That if you're super bent on making everything like ultra, I mean, I don't believe in originality fundamentally. I feel like if you're not in conversation with other work, then what you have written will be incomprehensible, and not, that it is conversation. Art has to be in conversation, but I do think that having open connections, right? If you're busy hiding your connections, it makes it harder for the reader to get that pleasure. They can only have the pleasure of discovering a new story, but why not have all the pleasure?
I hope people see like the Anne McCaffrey and the Naomi Novik in my creation, like the place where I read it, the references, the things I loved. And it's really interesting what you said, because I think that when Temeraire came out in Israel, like there was a great event, and the person who like talked about it kept saying Napoleonic Wars with dragons, and soon enough the whole convention was just like saying Napoleonic Wars with dragons because it sounds so crazy and wonderful.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. People, you know, for a long time were like, so what made you think of it? And I was just sort of, but you put dragons in everything. You know, that is one of the wonderful things about coming out of fan fiction and the fan fiction impulse, right, Wrotham, that you were talking about, where, you know, that impulse of, I love this story, let me in. I want to get inside this story. I want to do more with it. And the point of that is that impulse, that is an impulse for the self. And I think this is actually really important as a writer, that if you start writing for yourself, if you start writing for the joy that you yourself gain, as opposed to for external affirmation, because you think in your head that you want to be a writer, and when you do it for your own joy, that is enormously helpful for your growth as an artist, because it means that you have an absolute perfect barometer, a judgment tool that supersedes everything else. Because what always matters the most is that you are enjoying your work, that you are finding pleasure in it, and it frees you to chase your own pleasure. And I do feel like no author can give pleasure who is not having pleasure. That you need joy in your own work. To give joy, and so I do think that it's really good to, so you know, so for me, like, and that sense of play that you get in fan fiction, that sense of why not, you know, like turn the characters into penguins. I've literally read that story. You know, put in dragons, absolutely. That nobody in fandom would bat an eye, right? And people were and meanwhile in mainstream fiction, people are like, well, how did you come up with this astonishing idea? Your brain must be like that galaxy image. And like, but no, you just put dragons in. Why not? Dragons are great. And
people can't fathom that. You're correct. It's like my story was both fantasy and science fiction, and people were like, oh, it's dragons, but it's stem cell treatment. How does that work? Just read fanfics, people. Yeah.
And I do think that sense of well, obviously, to write fan fiction was and remains like to some extent transgressive, right? You had to be doing something that was sort of like against the rules. And even now when fan fiction is more understood and people are less like, I don't get it. It still is, you still often get people being like, well, why don't you write pro? Right? Why don't you write commercial? And like, people are like, people almost routinely assume that I don't write fan fiction anymore. Right. That's the thing, you know, now people know about me, and like, if they're interviewing me, they're like, you know, what made you, you know, it's so when you stopped writing fanfic, I'm like, I last week, what, 3 days, you know, and that is, it's all connected for me, is what I'm trying to say, is that pleasure, that play is connected to the question of why dragons. The question is, why not dragons? And then in terms of how, you know, why dragons in the Napoleonic Wars? Well, I wanted to write Napoleonic Wars, and I wanted to write dragons, and swish, you know, and but more broadly, the question of like, why it's never why, it's why not. And there's no answer why not, right?
I just want to say I want a t-shirt with the words, I love this story, let me in. And if anyone is watching that also wants a t-shirt, so write to me.
Excellent.
We'll get like a...
Excellent. Yes, I want one.
I'm going to send you.
Yeah.
Hi. So I'm going to step into this discussion for a second, just so that we can move on to the next topic, even though I'm told that I'm completely frozen and no one can see me moving or living.
Oh, no.
But at least you guys can still hear me because I can hear you.
Yes.
So we will just do that. This will be a radio interview for me.
Okay.
So I want to take everything that you guys have said about fan fiction as a trope, as something that's both comforting and new, and the pleasure of those things and the pleasure of something comforting that's also something else. And I want to talk about another element of your stories, and that is the idea of a home that is both very comforting and also a place of maybe danger, or maybe something that is a little more negative or a little more controversial. So for Naomi, obviously it's, I at least saw that in Uprooted, where, there's the village that is both a home. Sorry, not the village,
forest,
the forest.
Callie, right.
The forest, which is both a home, but is also something a little bit dangerous. And for Vrotem, it's the place spirits in your City Guardian series, where, the city is a very comforting place, but there's also a sense of the city is a little all-consuming, and the city, at least for the main character, doesn't really allow him to leave, to do anything else except his relationship with the cities. So I wanted to ask both of you where the idea for something, for writing about a home that is also a kind of prison came from. Since I can't see you, which one of you would like to answer first?
You go first, Rotem.
Me?
Yes, I've been answering
we
first.
are all here for you. Okay,
go Rotem.
Okay,
I'm
gonna go short. So my city spirits idea, which is like that every city has like a play spirit that appears as a woman and can talk to you. It came from like a song I heard, a Dow Williams song called Southern California Wants to be Western New York. And,
I love that song. Yes.
Do you know the song? Oh, that's a wonderful song.
And as soon as you said that, I was like, as soon as you started saying Dar Williams, I was like, oh, yes. Because I see that connection to that story.
So much connections. So this song tapped into some kind of a feeling that I got whenever I like walk around the city, that it's like a living thing. And it's a comforting thought, I guess, because the city that like takes care of you, that is happy to see you. And I lived at Tel Aviv at the time, and I live at Tel Aviv again now. And I was always thinking, I was fantasizing about stuff like that I like can go and a red light would turn green and there would be no traffic jams. I would always have a parking spot. I'll never stand in line in a restaurant, and I'll never be hot. There will always be a cold breeze on my face. And I started thinking about this, and this was like very interesting to like, research. But at some point I came to think about the city as something that's not human. It's like, it's super strong, it's powerful, it doesn't know who we are as humans, it doesn't understand pain, it doesn't understand life or death. So this would be kind of creepy. So it got me thinking, am I like in prison in Tel Aviv because I love this city and my life is here, my work is here, my partner is here, most of my friends live here or around here, but I almost never leave. And this is like something that Tel Avivians are made fun of in Israel. You never leave Tel Aviv. And whenever we go outside of Tel Aviv, all the road signs lead back to Tel Aviv because you can't go back alone. You won't find your way, you'll get lost. So I was thinking, I'm
sorry, I just love this because, so
it's the same with New York.
Well, it's even worse in New York in that if you're on Manhattan, it's like, how do you get out? You can't get out of Manhattan. Like if you want to go, like literally, we've gone to Brooklyn maybe a dozen times. And it's just, and in fact, hilariously, I've gone to Brooklyn more in the past year than I had just because of the pandemic. We got a car and suddenly I could just drive to Brooklyn as opposed to you sit on the train for hours and hours, and the train service was much worse when you got introverted. So yes, that sense of being trapped is so real. It's so real. Yes.
It is. And so, I mean, everybody loves to travel, right? I mean, we all have like a bucket list of places we want to visit. So, but we can't live the life of like travel. There's very few people that can travel like as their day job. So, I mean, I live here. I love this place, but it's also kind of prison. Whenever I go out, I mean, I was at WorldCon in Ireland where we met, and I was thinking, this is so pretty. Why don't I live here? Why? And I can't. My life is here, but this is also kind of a place that I'm anchored to, that I can't live without like very large repercussions. So this is kind of what I was thinking about. It's a place that's also comforting and a home and a place I love, but also kind of prison for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No,
what about the forest?
Yes. So for me, the forest in Uprooted, so, you know, it's interesting. We were sort of going back and forth on the title for a long time. And I almost wanted to call it Alas, because in Polish, the word for forest is las. And, you know, my mother's family were foresters. My uncle was like a ranger, forest ranger. I don't know if and lived in the woods. My mother grew up, would tell me stories just casually of sort of like going to pick mushrooms in the woods. And just walking in the woods. And she conveyed to me, you know, this is, I touched on this a little bit, like the things that you're given by your parents, and that you're sort of thinking about, well, what am I going to pass on? And one of the things she gave to me was this sense of nature, of the forest as a place of health, as a place of healing, as a place of the generation of life, of sort of like a heart place, a good place. But a lot of fairy tales, a lot of classic fairy tales that we get in English, obviously they come from the Grimm tradition, and they come from the Black Forest. And it's the forest is like, you know, and obviously stories of like Baba Yaga. It's like the stories, there are forests that are very bad, right? That, you know, it's probably sort of like a question of generations, right? It's, you know, a certain era, the forests were filled with predators and much more danger. And that sort of duality of the power of the forest connected sort of, you know, so what about a forest that was both, that should have been this nurturing place, but was corrupted. And more broadly, right, Uprooted in a way is this story of things that have gone wrong. You know, of Agnieszka having been taken out of her home, you know, this sense of being uprooted, literally, you know, like the roots dangling down, this plant sort of trying to find ground, trying to find water, is connected to the ways in which the forest has gone wrong, and the way in which the dragon Sarkhan has gone wrong. And how all these wrongnesses in a way are connected to one another, and that sort of intertwining of things things that have been turned from a good and healthy and joyful place, a joyful purpose, and then, you know, within that, the sense of you know, in Uprooted, obviously, being rooted to a place, being part of a place is a positive thing, because it's a positive thing for Agnieszka. Agnieszka does not want to detach herself from her valley. She looks at the outside world, and she looks at the outside world with a certain kind of judgment, right? That she's like, you know, this is not for me. I don't want this. I want to stay in my valley. I don't want, you know, and that what Sarkhan is doing when he separates the girls from their roots, and then the girls get to go to the city with a big dowry purse of silver and live, you know, in his eyes, happily ever after. It's something that Agnieszka utterly rejects that choice. And in fact, she is deeply sort of made frustrated and unhappy and doesn't fully understand Sarkhan, Sarkhan literally walling himself up, right? From Agnieszka's perspective, Sarkhan does to himself what is done to the Wood Queen, right? By breaking her up in this cell. Sarkhan literally does it he builds the tower around himself and keeps himself separate from the valley, from his people, from the people around him. And that is, so in that way, Uprooted is a very opinionated book in that way, in that it's the story of somebody for whom that rooting in place is very much a positive and refusing to reject it. And that's partly because so much of fantasy does valorize, the epic journey, the leaving home, the never going home again, right? That like Frodo comes back to the Shire and he doesn't get to stay. Agnieszka gets to stay. She
decides to stay. Yes,
right.
She's like, I'm gonna root myself back, no matter what you say.
Yes,
I love the moment where she finds out why he's like taking the girls, and she says, I can't believe you're doing this. I just like she realizes her connection to the wood, and she realizes that however she looks at other people. When she goes to the city and she understands that's like that for her, they think of her as crazy, just like she thinks of them as crazy. Right. Because why does she stay in this very dangerous place? And the different perspectives, I love that.
Yeah, and that's really, to me, I feel like that's one of the engines of excitement about the book, is that sort of the healthy and the corrupted, and what sort of the kinds of pains that transform, that corrupt, and the healing from it. Yeah.
Okay, we have a few minutes left. So I'm going to use one of the questions that we haven't answered yet, and I will ask you kind of a very brief question, or at least as brief as you guys want to make it.
Yeah, sorry.
No. We're here for you. We want to hear you talk.
So you've both spoken about, inspirations and how texts are always in conversation with each other. Can you talk about some of the writers or some of the books that inspired you, aside from the writers and books that we've already mentioned in this conversation? Can be one creator, can be one book, or it can be something broader.
You go. Otherwise, I will just talk about you. I'm sorry.
Oh.
Go, Naomi.
There's so many. I talked a little bit about this yesterday, how I do feel, one of the things I often get asked, and there's going to be this writing workshop event either tomorrow or the day after. I don't remember what day it is today.
I think it's tomorrow.
Right. Yes. But one of the things that I'm often asked is what do you recommend for somebody who wants to become a writer? And I have several excellent pieces of advice. But one of the key things is just that you just have to read all the time, and you have to read and to read a lot, and to read all sorts of different things. And that is advice that, and it's not just necessarily about reading books. It's also about literally just browsing the internet, things like, actually, I would say that one of the things that really inspired me the other day was I don't know if any of you know this YouTube channel called Kyrgyzats in a nutshell, where they do sort of science videos, and they distill science ideas into really clear sort of nuggets of information. So you can read about, neutron stars and very quickly absorb information. And in fact, so I'm digressing here a little bit. This is obviously an invitation to name a bunch of wonderful books, and I love doing that. But I've been having this interesting thought that I kind of want to like dump on you all. So, which is that I do feel like one of the things that's happening in our sort of civilization, broadly speaking, is our ability to process information has been dramatically altered. You know, people have been writing about artificial intelligence for so many years. I feel like artificial intelligence is here and it's us. You know, that now when you think about it, if you wanted to understand a scientific process, something complex, like for instance, how a vaccine works, how a virus works, to learn that would have been almost unimaginably difficult, and suddenly is not. And suddenly now you can go to Wikipedia, and obviously you don't become an expert by reading a few Wikipedia pages, but what you do get is like a sort of vague, cloudy, mistaken in a few places understanding that that nevertheless facilitates, being able to communicate about it, being able to understand the world in these sort of concrete ways, and rely on your own understanding of things. And that, I think, is something that's increasingly part of my own writing. So I would say that reading, you have to be curious, right? That sense of being open to all sorts of different books, all sorts of different stories. You know, I'm just sort of looking over at my own shelf. I've got, like, right next to me, I've got, you know, Edgar Allan Poe. I've got the annotated Dracula. I've got, sorry, I'll pull out, like, this is something that my mother used to read to me when I was a very small child. It's English and Polish facing. And this is the story of, King Piast, the sort of the idea of the founding of Poland's early, you know, the king, one of the lines of kings of Poland, in a sort of pagan era, right? And you see these kinds of pagan priests, and obviously, and this is the cutting of hair, and
it all goes in.
Yes, and it all goes in, and these little pieces that you collect from stories all the time, all kind of, you know, you need to let things in. You need to collect a lot of things. You need to let a lot of things in. And sometimes, in a way, it's not necessarily the things that you love. Like, actually, just recently, my husband, during the pandemic, read Don Quixote to my daughter out loud.
Wow.
The entire book. And I mean, it's like more than 1,000 pages long. And I have to say, there was parts of it where I was just like, okay, Don Quixote needs to end now. Because it was just felt like the same thing happening over and over and over and over again. It was, you know, it's that interesting, that sort of serial, you know, I'm not one of those people who post serial stories, because I like endings, I like completion. And so I get very impatient with serial stories myself. And so Don Quixote was like the worst serial story ever. Just kept going and going and going, and nothing happened. And then all of a sudden, he started reading the second half of the book. The second half, which I myself would never in a billion years have gotten to if I was reading it myself. And he got to this point where suddenly the second book starts out with Cervantes basically like really angry because somebody wrote fanfic of Don Quixote, but they published it they published it and sold it. He was angry because it was not non-commercial. And so there's this long, so what he did was he wrote it into the story. Don Quixote himself, the character, knows that there's somebody going around pretending to be him. And he's like, they're not the real Don Quixote. I am the only real Don Quixote. And in fact, he says, and Cervantes says, like, I'm going to kill this character at the end of the book so no one else can ever write him again. And there were all sorts of other sort of bizarre, like, it gets increasingly like metatextual in ways that you know, you think are super modern. And all of a sudden it's like, no, Cervantes did everything. every weird metatextual thing that you can think of that's ever been done in a novel. He did it. And it was one of those things where I would never have had that experience of that text on my own. It was forced on me unwillingly. It's like I did not consent to this, and yet I feel like that's in my head now, and I don't know what's going to happen with it. But it's
you learn more from books you don't like.
Yeah, and so in a way, I feel like that's, as a writer, right? Everything is grist for the mill, and that's a wonderful thing. That's a wonderful thing.
That is an amazing note to stop on, which unfortunately we have to do since we're already a few minutes over the time. Thank you so much, amazing. Naomi. It's really great to do this in radio format because you can't even see my face when I say that, but please believe me, I'm very grateful for both of you for doing this.
This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who watched us. And, we'll see you tomorrow Naomi will see you tomorrow for the workshop for those of you who signed up. And she also has a panel on Thursday. And hopefully we'll see you then. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Marina.
Thank you, Marina.
Nice Olmot.